Hey, everybody. Today for you, podcast number 028. Today's podcast is titled Fire and Ice. Hey, everybody. Today's podcast titled Fire and Ice. I'm Dr. Pete Lombardi, and this is the Limitless Life Network podcast, where we flesh out all the objections that are preventing you from reaching your goals and living the life that you deserve. Today, we have a special guest with us today, Dr. Stephen G., or also known as Dr. Steve Geanopulos. He's here visiting us, and the reason we're calling this Fire and Ice is because this is the annual snowmobile trip weekend that he comes to visit my camp in the Adirondacks, and we go snowmobiling. And since we're sitting by the wood stove tonight after riding snowmobiles today, we decided to sit down and have a conversation about some things that are really his wheelhouse. So today we're going to talk about something called the Atlas panel. And the Atlas panel is a set of blood chemistry tests that really flesh out limitations in people's health on a cellular level. So Dr. G, could you tell us or tell me and explain to me and our listeners really how you came up with this panel and what is it really all about?
Yeah, so that was a great introduction to this weekend and to this topic, and I can talk about this topic for hours. So the Atlas panel, first of all, we call it the Atlas panel simply because the Atlas holds the world on his shoulders, and your world is your health, and it's on your shoulders. So when it comes to the Atlas panel, we take all of the blood chemistry markers that are common to every doctor's visit you've ever had. So whatever your doctor would order on an annual test, your lipids, your basic markers, then we took a bunch of markers that we wanted to add to that give us a much more comprehensive picture that we could say, if you're human and you're living in the year 2023 or in the modern day, these markers would be relevant to everyone. So it's a more expanded panel. It includes everything your doctor would ever include in a blood test, and then some. So we include some inflammatory markers, some immune system markers. We include some other metabolic markers.
So if we were to really break it down, Dr. G, isn't it, the way I've always viewed it is it's kind of based in a systematic form, like there's like 8 different systems, am I correct?
Yeah, we break down the Atlas panel into 8 bodily systems that really have to work together. So there's, you could argue there are 6 systems, there are 14 systems. Well, we broke it down into 8.
And why did you pick 8? And I mean, what's the reasoning behind why these 8? Why are they the most important ones, would you say?
Because they're actionable. They're markers that even if they're in the normal range, if they're skewed in one direction or another as they relate to some of the other markers in the panel, we can kind of pick up on trends. So the 8 categories are how these 8 systems in the body really work together. And we can identify lifestyle changes that people can make that can actually alter those markers. So the objective of doing a blood test is to see what we're starting with, make lifestyle interventions, and then recheck it and see the improvement according to the systems, not to the individual marker only.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you said, I'm going to go back to this, is you talked about the ranges. And if you could give our listeners an explanation of the importance of the ranges and these reference ranges, where do they come from? I mean, I like the way you explain it. I try to explain it to people, and it doesn't always come out as good.
It's such an important question because the reference range is, so if you could just imagine the last blood test you had, there's what was checked on the left, there's your value that you got to the right of that, and then over to the right, there's a reference range. And if you're within the range, let's just say the marker XYZ, the range is between 5 and 10, and your number is 7. You're within the range, and therefore it's normal. Well, that reference range we think of as being normal and abnormal, but really that reference range is common and uncommon. So what I mean by that is the reference ranges for almost every marker other than total cholesterol and something called A1C, all of the other markers are based on the experience of the laboratory that you went to. So you're basically comparing yourself to the other people who've been to that laboratory. And that is the reference range. Now, the only problem with, and that's smart, it's called community rating. But your community may not be the healthiest community in the world. So those reference ranges can be different from city to city, state to state, laboratory to laboratory. And you have to ask yourself, do I want to compare myself to other people who get their blood checked? And if so, who's more likely to get their blood checked more, sick people or healthy people? And of course, it's sick people.
Right.
So comparing yourself to sick people is not the best way to look at trends in your own health.
Okay.
So our profession went to the same biochemists who come up with these numbers and said, hey, could you kind of give us a range that we could say is optimal? What are the numbers for the healthiest among us? And as you can imagine, they came up with a much tighter range. So we will comment if something is, of course, out of the reference range, but we'll also comment if it's out of the optimal range.
Okay. When you say our profession went and said, who are you referring to, your profession?
That's a great question. So there is this term called functional medicine. It's a term that I'm not particularly crazy about because it doesn't really say a whole lot. There is no functional medicine organization. So people who are doctors that are looking at blood tests for the purpose of increasing health, improving performance, not just identifying and treating disease, they're the ones who are in this community. And it's, certainly no secret that there are doctors that specialize in working with the healthiest among us, whether they be professional athletes or what have you. But we also have to recognize there are millions and millions of people who are taking lots and lots of medication, which also can really skew these numbers. So for example, the reference range for something as simple as thyroid stimulating hormone, because millions of people are taking thyroid medication, that reference range is not very useful. Right. So when I say our profession, those of us in the healthcare community who frequently order blood work and have an expertise in reading blood work, they go to the biochemist and say, what are the numbers for cohorts of people that are considered the healthiest among us as opposed to the sickest among us?
Okay. So let's start off with, the first category or the first system that you think is the most important system to test. What would you say that is?
Red blood cells.
Red blood cells. Just like that. Red blood cells. Definitely red blood cells. Why red blood cells?
All right. Well, when it comes to your health, your central nervous system controls everything, right? So, we can say there are 8 body systems or 12 body systems, whatever number we want to assign, but every one of those systems is under the direct control of the central nervous system. So we say that the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord, makes up about 2% of your body weight. However, it uses up to 30% of your fuel. And that's a big deal. So if this is the most metabolically active part of your body, controlling all of the other systems, well, then how we deliver fuel is incredibly important. And 50% of that fuel story is how we deliver oxygen. And the red blood cells' only job is to deliver oxygen. Anything that's suboptimal about your red blood cell health will skew your ability to deliver oxygen, which will affect how your central nervous system can control all of those other systems.
Yeah, that is super important, right? Anybody that's ever had trouble breathing knows how important oxygen is, right? So what are we looking at? What do you see commonly with red blood cell health?
And this is great because the CBC, complete blood count, is the most basic set of blood work. Right. It's something you can get anywhere in the world. And if you're outside of New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, you can probably get it for $3. And the complete blood count tells us how many red blood cells we have, so how many of these cells can actually deliver oxygen. It tells us how much protein that carries the oxygen is within the red blood cell, so we call that hemoglobin. It tells us what percentage of cells in your blood are red blood cells. That's called hematocrit. It tells us the size of the red blood cell. A very tiny red blood cell is inefficient, and a very large red blood cell is inefficient. So these are all different categories that are going to tell us if there's a probability that your ability to deliver oxygen is skewed in one direction or another.
Okay, good. So what are some common findings though that you see there? Like what are some common things that are screwed up with people's red blood cells? Like what do you see them like with the most?
What we see the most is something called macro or microcytosis, where again, fat red blood cells, tiny red blood cells, and the protein content within the red blood cells called hemoglobin. Those are the three most common things that we see a compromise in. And it's interesting because all three of them are controlled by nutrients that we get from our food and not necessarily just from disease processes.
So do you find it interesting that some people just have really do you think it's all diet related, why their red blood cells are too big or too small? Or could it be that maybe they don't absorb their nutrients from their food well?
Okay, so that's a great question, right? So yes, the nutrients that we get into our body is going to come from our diet. And it's not a question of do I have a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet always. If you have a very healthy diet but a digestive system that doesn't process the food properly, well, they say you are what you eat. Well, technically you are what you eat, digest, and absorb.
Yeah.
So if you do have a problem with that, your ability to bring in those nutrients from your healthy diet is going to be compromised.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that people struggle with is they don't understand that even though they eat really well, they can still have some skewed numbers on these tests that are really limiting their health, and they don't know it. Because it doesn't feel that different, right?
That's correct. And there's so many things that can impact your ability to digest food, right? There's, stress that you have in your life. It's something as simple as do you have the news, the news playing while you're eating dinner and you're getting aggravated while you're having dinner, or are you fighting with family members?
Sure.
So all of those things can impact your digestion. But really, this all goes to what we call metabolic health. And it's a term that really has kind of taken off. And it's funny because the word metabolic, if you don't know what it means, there's really not another word to replace it.
Right.
And my definition of the word metabolic is how your body uses energy. And we get our energy from our food. Not only do we get nutrition or nutrients from our food, we get energy from our food. And then your body has to take that food in and then use those nutrients in order to make your energy that much more efficient.
Right. Yeah. All right. What's another system? What's number 2? What's the
right
second most important thing would be?
Blood sugar.
Blood sugar. Blood sugar. Okay.
So that's the fuel story, right? So oxygen and glucose. That's 50-50. That's,
two biggest fuel sources.
Yeah. The analogy I always like to use is every cell in your body, if you think of them, each cell as being like an automobile. An automobile has an engine. You give fuel to that engine, the wheels turn, and you create what we call horsepower. Well, your cells are the same way. They each have an engine, and when that engine is turned on and starts to spin, instead of horsepower, it produces energy that we just call ATP. So your car engine needs air and gasoline to combust together in the engine to make horsepower. Well, your cells need oxygen and glucose to combust in the engine, we call the mitochondria, to make energy that we call ATP.
Adenosine triphosphate.
Yes, very good.
Okay, so a big thing we see with blood sugar is what?
Abnormal blood sugar.
Yeah, which is most often referred to as
hyperglycemia or too much blood sugar, but there's also hypo. So we always say too much blood sugar is toxic, too little blood sugar is toxic.
Okay.
It has to be just right.
And you always have this great analogy when it comes to blood sugar when you talk about blood sugar and insulin
Absolutely.
resistance, the bucket analogy.
At any given time, in your bloodstream, and if I were to take all of your blood and put it into a bucket on the table in front of me, it would be a pretty sizable bucket. It would be 5 liters of blood. At any given time, within 90 minutes of eating, I don't care if you ate 90 minutes ago, 9 hours ago, or 9 days ago. It doesn't matter. Your 5 liters, that bucket full of blood, should have a single teaspoon, 4 grams of glucose.
Okay.
Now, if you have 5 grams of glucose, so that's a teaspoon. So on your blood test, a teaspoon is the number basically 85 to 90 represents the 4 grams or a teaspoon in the 5 liters. If you had 5 grams, you're a diabetic.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Isn't that crazy? That's how tightly regulated blood sugar is.
Yeah. And so most people are very familiar with the hormone that regulates that, which is insulin, right?
So it's insulin and a bunch of others.
And a bunch of others.
Yeah.
But that's the most common one that everybody thinks about. When you think of diabetes, you think of people getting insulin shots.
Correct.
And so forth. Yeah.
Correct. So if you are 13 years old and you're super healthy,
right,
and you're eating, you just get your hands on a whole big chocolate cake and you, you have the whole chocolate cake and there's a lot of teaspoons of sugar. There's a lot of teaspoons of sugar floating around, and that sugar is so incredibly toxic that you efficiently release that insulin. The insulin then takes that sugar out of your blood within 90 minutes so that all of those additional teaspoons of sugar go back to 1 teaspoon of sugar, which is your set point. However, as we get older, our ability to efficiently do that is not that of a 13-year-old.
Right.
It starts to decline as we get older.
It does.
For all of us, not just diabetics, for all of us.
So what are some strategies for people, like not from a diet standpoint, but from a physical standpoint? What is one of the best things people can do to help regulate blood sugar physically?
So the issue with blood sugar is the overabundance that we have of food. We're very blessed to be living in the time that we live in the country that we live in. And that part of that blessing is just an incredible amount of abundance that we have. So when it comes to food, there's 3 kinds of food, 3 categories.
Right.
There's protein, there's fat, and there's carbohydrates. And carbohydrates is what we efficiently break down into glucose.
Right.
Okay. So the issue that we have is this overabundance is creating a situation where every single one of us is, first of all, playing with fire, because carbohydrate is the only kind of food, the only category of food you can actually become addicted to. And you don't have a regulatory mechanism to limit how much you eat.
Wow.
There's a regulatory mechanism to limit fat. If you try to eat too much fat, you're not going to be able to. Your body won't let you. You'll get nauseous.
Yep.
Same thing with protein. But there is no regulation on carbohydrates or sugar.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Yeah, that explains a lot, doesn't it? When you think about the number of people that just love sugar. They just love carbs. They just got to have them. They get super addicted.
So then the strategy, right? So the strategy is this. If I'm drinking more alcohol than I should, but I'm not an alcoholic, it's pretty easy to just drink less and make that conscious decision. I'm going to drink less alcohol. But if I'm an alcoholic and I'm addicted to alcohol, you can't just switch me from whiskey to light beer. That's not going to help my health.
Right.
I'm an addict. There's only one solution for that addict. It's to abstain.
Right.
But if you're not an addict, you don't necessarily have to abstain, but you can reduce. All right. If we say that sugar or glucose has similar similar properties as alcohol and other things that we could be addicted to, other drugs we can be addicted to, well, then you have to ask yourself, am I an addict? Your strategy is completely different if you're an addict.
Right.
Now, if you're not an addict, you just have been going out to dinner a little too much, enjoying the holidays a little, you can certainly reduce. So
Sure.
yes, reducing carbohydrates is one way to look at it, but you could also just increase the other 2. Increase your fat, quality fat, increase your protein, quality protein, and you'll have less room for the carbohydrate. That's something a non-addict can certainly do to improve their blood sugar story.
Yeah, it's a pretty good strategy. Yeah.
But it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
And you know who you are if you're addicted to carbohydrates.
For sure. Let's move on to system number 3. What do you say is number 3 on the list?
We call it heart health, right?
Okay.
Lipids. And, this is the cholesterol story.
So does cholesterol give you heart disease?
Yes and no.
All right, good. I wanted people to understand this. So
It's so important for everyone listening to this to understand that you cannot have blood vessel disease or heart disease, that which causes strokes and heart attacks, without LDL cholesterol, what is called the bad cholesterol. It's impossible to have heart disease and have it not include LDL cholesterol. Now, this is a great analogy because it's very factual. In the same way, it's impossible to have a fire like we have over my left shoulder here. It's impossible to have a fire without oxygen. As a matter of fact, right when we started this podcast, the fire was going out, and what did we do? We just opened the door a little bit to the fireplace, and oxygen went in, and the fire got bigger. So, in order to have heart disease, you must have LDL cholesterol, but then in order to have a fire, you must have oxygen. So then does oxygen cause fire?
no,
So then does LDL cholesterol cause heart disease?
no,
But you can't have heart disease without it.
yeah. So, you have
So
to-
it's necessary for heart disease, but not sufficient.
okay. So what else is necessary for heart disease? What are the three ingredients that create heart disease?
So the three ingredients for heart disease, well, the three ingredients for a fire is oxygen, a spark, and something to burn.
Right.
The three
Fuel.
ingredients for heart disease or blood vessel disease is LDL cholesterol, inflammation, and a sustained immune response. All three have to be present. And we, in our Atlas panel, are able to pick up aspects of inflammation and an immune response that you have power over, you have control over, whereas your LDL cholesterol is a little bit harder unless your cholesterol story is a metabolic one where the pattern is very obvious.
Sure.
Then there's a lot you can do for your cholesterol. But you can certainly do a whole lot for your inflammation and your immune response.
Okay. All right. So what's next after heart health?
Our ability to detoxify. So your detoxification health, we call it liver and kidney health, two of your main organs of detoxification, right?
Okay.
So, and again, all of these are very tied together, right? Because we started with oxygen together with glucose or blood sugar. That is the fuel that our body uses. And then if your blood sugar system is off, the way your body protects you is by trying really hard to get rid of that sugar. And we do that by asking the liver to detoxify us from the excess sugar. The way the liver does that is it takes the extra sugar and it transforms it, turns it into body fat or triglycerides, one of the markers found on a lipid panel. And when those triglycerides start to creep above 100, now the laboratory reference range is 149. But if it creeps above 100, then we know your liver is working hard to take the extra carbohydrate, turn it into triglycerides. But now those triglycerides, as they climb, they need to be trafficked to different cells in the body for storage. That's your body fat, right?
Right.
Well, if you're going to take those triglycerides, oil and water, fat and water don't mix. So your bloodstream is water, your triglycerides are fat. You need a vehicle in which to transport those triglycerides. And that vehicle is called cholesterol, LDL cholesterol in particular. So now your liver is going to make LDL cholesterol a vehicle, a boat, so to speak, to put the triglycerides onto to deliver them to your body fat for storage. So now all of these stories are related to each other because as your liver does this, the enzymes responsible start to climb.
Okay.
And we call that fatty liver. Your liver is working hard. When those enzymes start to climb, and we can see that on the Atlas panel, we checked 3 of the major ones. When they start to climb above a certain number, that tells us the liver is just working really hard to make more fat. And eventually that fat is just going to accumulate around the liver, and that's called fatty liver.
Okay. And so now that you said the liver detoxifies, so you give a really great analogy using a bridge with liver detoxification.
So your liver is a one-way bridge going from the inside of your body to the outside of your body. And the cars on that bridge represent the toxins you're trying to get rid of. Well, like being on any bridge, the bridge works fine, the liver is fine, it works. But when there's just a lot of traffic, well then there's going to be a buildup. There's going to be a slowdown in how quickly those vehicles move across the bridge from the inside of the body to the outside, and the buildup is going to be on the inside of the body. So there'll be a delay in your ability to remove toxins from your body. So what we want to do is open up those lanes, open up those pathways. Of course, we want less toxicity, right?
Sure.
So we have to address it both. We need to open up the lanes, make sure there's no construction going on, there's no lanes that are shut down. And I use the term lanes in the world of physiology. There's 5 detoxification pathways through the liver. So just imagine 5 lanes. And we want to make sure that each of those lanes or pathways has the nutrition and the needs, the micronutrients they need to traffic those cars, those vehicles across the bridge.
Okay, great. So what's next after detoxing liver, kidney? What else?
We mentioned the liver. Mentioned the liver. But
what about the kidney?
What about the kidneys?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Kidney beans.
Again, the same story holds true. It's just done in a little bit of a different way. But we can pick up the markers that we check. We can pick up the kidney's ability to remove certain things that can be inflammatory or toxic. So, for example, uric acid. It's a very commonly looked at inflammatory marker that is also one of the top causes of kidney stones.
Sure.
Right? So we want to look at that and the ability to remove that. We want to look for a buildup of a byproduct in the body called creatinine. And we want to look at the amount of nitrogen that's in the blood, because nitrogen in the blood, there's a balance we're supposed to have, and the kidney regulates that balance.
Okay, good. All right, so we got that taken care of.
All right, so we got
what's next?
Four categories.
Yes,
4 out of 8. All right.
4 out of 8.
The 5th one is mineral and electrolyte health.
Okay, mineral and electrolyte health, and why are minerals and electrolytes even important?
So
what are they for? What do they do?
There's so many things that they do.
So many things.
But just the term electrolytes.
Okay.
Think electricity. Your body is electric. You can't contract a muscle without there being a difference in electricity inside the cell and outside the cell. You can't fire a nerve. You can't get your brain to think without there being a gradient of electricity. And in the body, those are positively and negatively charged particles that are in a very delicate balance. They have names like calcium, magnesium, chloride, carbon dioxide. These are all going to have a positive or a negative charge, and their balance is something that's very tightly regulated in the system. So, for example, we commonly see magnesium being low. Well, when magnesium is low, we have all kinds of problems with sleep. We have problems with digestion. We have problems having bowel movements. There's 600 different enzyme processes in the body that require magnesium. If those levels are inadequate, it's going to represent a health problem.
Okay, good. All right, what's next?
Thyroid.
Why the thyroid? Why is that next?
The thyroid is the word is a Greek word, by the way. The Greeks came up with the best words. The word thyroid means shield. It's a shield. It protects you. It's shaped like a shield, and it's right here in your throat, in your neck. And every single cell in the human body has a receptor for thyroid hormone. That means it's super important. And what thyroid hormone does is regulate the energy needs of every cell. So the analogy I use for people who drive normal cars, or cars that we grew, with the engines we grew up with. When I was a kid and I bought a cheap car for $500, I would always worry on a winter day that I stop at a light and the idle would be really low and it would flutter and stall.
Yeah.
Well, the engine, the idle, is set by thyroid hormone in each of your cells. So if you have too much thyroid hormone, it's like the idle of the engine is set too high. It's revving way too high.
Okay.
If it's too low, well, then it's sputtering.
Gotcha.
And it's about to stall. So that has to be perfect. And we check all of the markers, not just to tell us if you need thyroid medication, but if you're able to utilize that hormone in your body so that you can convert it into its usable form. And that's impacted by things like inflammation and lifestyle choices that we make.
Okay, which brings us to point number
Then we go off to the immune system.
Yeah, that's kind of important, isn't it?
Super important.
Okay, so what are we looking at there? What are there's probably some familiar ones that people are used to
Your
hearing.
white blood cells, right? So how many white blood cells do you have? And then there's different categories of white blood cells. There's white blood cells that fight bacteria. There's white blood cells that fight viruses. We want to know, are they high or are they low? If they're high, you might have an acute infection going on. But if they're low, you may have a chronic infection going on. If it's low for the lymphocytes, which fight viruses, there might be a chronic virus like Epstein-Barr. If it's low and it's neutrophils, it could be a bacterial infection. And the most common chronic bacterial infections that we see are in the gut, where the immune system is just not taking care of a old gut infection and it's just working overtime trying to deal with that. And then when it comes to the immune system, we also look at that which regulates the immune system, things like vitamin D. You can't have a normal immune system without sufficient vitamin D.
Yeah. So I mean, we've had many people tested with this, and that is one thing that always seems to be significantly low on people and nowhere's near what would be ideal. Is that something you see with all your clients across the country?
Yes. That it's no mystery. There's a million studies that have been done on the how much vitamin, how deficient we are as a people.
So why is that? Why in the world is everybody basically in the United States low in vitamin D unless they're supplementing with it?
Well, the best way it's really difficult to get sufficient vitamin D in your diet. So what you do is you have to make it. And you make vitamin D from cholesterol. So you need cholesterol to make vitamin D. It's technically not a vitamin. It's technically a hormone. It's a hormone you make. And you make it from cholesterol like all of your other hormones. So chronically taking statin medications and medications that would reduce the available pool of cholesterol, that's
going to drive it down right there.
That can drive it down. But also lack of the stimulus. The stimulus we have is when the sun hits our skin. Look, prior to 1885, which was not that long ago, when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, the only source of light on planet Earth was the sun and fire. So since then, we've been able to live our lives indoors under electric lights. And not that there's anything wrong with that, except that you find yourself outdoors way less than your ancestors did.
Sure.
And then you might say, oh, no, but the sun is going to give you cancer. Well, that's debatable. And we're not nocturnal creatures. We're not like raccoons, right, that live out at night. We're humans. We need to be in the daylight, and that means we need to get more sun than we're currently getting.
Right.
And the oily layer on top of your skin is where that chemical process occurs. Well, if you're spending the day outside being very active, let's say you're a lifeguard in Laguna Beach and you're out there all day long, you take showers every day because we're clean people.
Right.
And we probably overuse soap.
Sure.
And we just take that oily layer off of us on a daily basis. And that also compromises. So if you look at dietary factors, if you look at cholesterol factors, if you look at our hygiene, all of these things, our lack of natural sunlight, all of those things together lead to a lower vitamin D level and a dysregulated immune system because of that.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you check?
Yes, inflammation.
Inflammation. Is that number 8?
That's number 8.
I thought so. Yes, number 8. Everybody that's listening is like, what? What about inflammation? What does that mean? What does it mean to have inflammation in your cells?
In inflammation or in your system,
your
systemic inflammation. So you could have inflammation. If I kick you in the shins, you're going to have local inflammation because I kicked you in the shins, right? And that actually is a repair process that requires the immune system.
So that's a lot of times, I think that's when people think about when they think of inflammation is like, oh, my knee is inflamed because I twisted my knee and it's sprained, or I've got a bursitis in my hip or something. They think that's inflammation. But you're talking about like a global, systemic, throughout your whole body inflammation.
Correct. One of the markers we check is called C-reactive protein. It's actually produced by the liver. And the liver is going to, again, respond to an environment. So if the environment is unfavorable and requiring the body to heal, and that's what inflammation is. It's when the immune system is chronically activated and it's trying to fix something, it's going to overproduce something called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is tightly related to cardiovascular disease, et cetera. And typically, since 85% of the human immune system is in the gut, it's related to food.
Wow.
It's related to food. So we could say chronic systemic inflammation is most commonly related to food.
So our food creates inflammation.
Yes.
So what are the most common foods that create inflammation, would you say?
All of them.
Really? So everything. Like
Allow me to explain.
If I eat a
Allow
piece,
me to
if I eat a
explain.
piece of lettuce, I'm gonna have an inflamed gut.
Nope.
Okay.
So the outside world is your food. The inside world is your bloodstream.
Okay.
Your small intestines is where those two worlds come really close together. That's where we digest food. The analogy I like to use is your digestive system is kind of like the security check at the airport. So everyone outside the airport wants to get inside the terminal. In order to get into the terminal, everybody has to go through the blue shirts. So that's your small intestines. Anything that needs to get through has to go through there. So that's where our defense mechanisms are. All plants have defense chemicals in them because plants are living things and they would like to, not go extinct due to the predators that eat them. That doesn't mean food is bad for you. It's just your immune system is alert. It's going to try to digest proteins and break them down before they're absorbed into your bloodstream. If you're having difficulty doing that, people with stomach acid problems, et cetera, then large undigested proteins start to leak into the bloodstream. And when they do, it excites the immune system, and that's the inflammatory process.
Okay.
All food. Now, that doesn't mean food's bad for you. It just means that there's a low level of inflammation that occurs as it should. It's normal.
Okay.
The problems occur when it becomes excessive.
Okay. So what causes it to become excessive? So, I mean, everybody's trying to think, like, how does this relate to me? Like, what can I do when it comes to what I'm choosing to eat and so forth?
You
like,
should choose foods that look the way it did when it was growing out of the ground,
Okay.
crawling on the,
Walking on the earth.
swimming in the ocean.
Okay.
In other words, food should look like its original form. So, for example, if you look at a tortilla chip, nothing tells you that that's corn.
Right.
But if you look at an apple, it's what came off the tree.
Right.
So eat real food.
So stay away from anything that's processed, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yep, for sure.
So, and why is processed stuff, why does that create so much more inflammation than, say, a whole food?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of different ways.
Lots of great questions.
I know. There's a lot of ways that happens. So if we take a plant and crush it up and take all of its component parts and start to separate them out and use them as individual ingredients in something that looks like something that came out of a bag that could stay in your pantry for the next 5 years, well, then the body doesn't recognize those nutrients in that form. And when you present it into your digestive, it's a very new phenomenon, right? So let's just take the obvious example, a Twinkie. Every ingredient in the Twinkie, or pasta, or some breads that you find in your supermarket.
Let's stick with Twinkie. I'm thinking of a Twinkie tree that Twinkies grow.
But if you look at the component parts of those foods, yes, there's chemicals in there, and there's other pesticides and herbicides and things that we just use in the industrial food making process.
So delicious.
Our immune
they
system
put them
just
into a
hates it.
Twinkie. It's so good.
And the scientists that make them really good, they know what is going to addict.
So what is the most common thing that you see, though? Like, of all these 8 different systems, what's the one that people really are struggling with the most?
Blood sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
far and away.
I know that it depends on your age. As you get older, it's going to be a little bit harder, right? Because hormonally, our cells are more insulin resistant versus the teenager that can eat the chocolate cake. So that's, as we age, it becomes a little bit bigger of a problem, and we become a little less active, maybe, especially in the working world. So what are some simple strategies? Like, give me 2 simple strategies for people to help bring blood sugar down.
The one strategy that I think you have to start with is acknowledging the fact that I alluded to it earlier. Let me put this into better perspective.
Okay.
Protein and fat is something that you auto-regulate. So if I'm starving, I'm just so hungry, and I have a 69-ounce ribeye tomahawk steak in front of me, I'm going to attack that steak as if I'm going to finish it all in one bite. But once I get filled, let's say I get through 40 ounces. That's a lot of steak. But there's still 29 ounces left. I'm going to bring that home for tomorrow because I'm full. I just can't. I can't take another bite.
Right.
We've all been there, right? You were so hungry, but you just can't finish it.
Right.
And then the waiter takes the plate away. Oh, and then he drops a chocolate cake in front of you. Oh, all of a sudden I have all this room for the chocolate cake. I couldn't take one more bite of the steak, but I can inhale a chocolate cake. And that's because there's no auto regulation for blood sugar. So the main thing is to fill up on protein and fat together. And whatever room you have left can be for some vegetables, which are a more acceptable form of carbohydrate. But focus on making sure your protein and fat is the primary ingredients of the meal you're about to eat. Allow that system to fill you up and get you away from the table in the kitchen. And then that way you're making choices for eating healthier foods that your body can regulate. So there's less room for the stuff you can't regulate. That's probably the best strategy. The next best strategy is recognizing if you have an addiction that it's behavior change that helps you get over an addiction. And the behavior changes would require you after a meal, one of the best things that you can do. What happens 15 minutes after a meal? You're full, then you start craving dessert. Well, then you should have already left the house to walk your dog. And that is a example of a behavioral change because by the time you get back from that dog walk, you may have already bypassed that craving. That wave may have hit while you were out and receded, and now you don't have to have a dessert after dinner. So those are two simple strategies.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned exercise, like walking the dog. Like I see so many people concentrating super hard on exercise to lose weight, and they never really, I don't know, they dabble in the diet side of it. They dabble in their habits and around eating, and they really struggle with their weight. And it's frustrating, I think, for people to do a tremendous amount of exercise for, say, 30, 40, 60, 90 days, and yet, they still didn't maybe lose a lot of weight, and they've been carrying all this excess body fat. And to me, it just comes back to if you can hone in the diet first, and get some good structure around that, then I believe that, the exercise doesn't have to be like this tremendous, aggressive, high intensity thing. I mean, just going for a walk 30 to 40 minutes a day to get your heart rate up. And you don't have to get your heart rate up so high that you can't have a conversation with the person next to you. That's kind of the way I like to regulate it. It's a heart rate where I'm breathing heavier, but I can still talk to the person I'm walking or hiking with.
Yeah, if people were listening to us having a conversation next to each other on a treadmill, let's say,
right,
it should sound like we're kind of huffing and puffing, but we're certainly able to carry that conversation.
We're not struggling to try to talk.
Correct.
Yeah, because then you're into the next levels of zone, and that isn't really a weight loss or even a blood sugar management zone at that point. Because now, if you get such a high intensity level, now you're affecting different hormones that are stress response hormones.
And you're going to manufacture more sugar to do that. And you're going to crave more sugar after that. So exercise, there's nothing more important, or I shouldn't say, there's nothing that you'll get more bang for your buck in than exercise when it comes to your metabolic health. But it's a very poor weight loss strategy because after that initial 3 months, as your body starts to auto-regulate, you don't really have an increase in calorie burn that makes the math equation work for you in a weight loss sense.
Yeah, so many people are like in that calorie mode, like, oh, I gotta burn off all those calories I ate. I ate too much last night, so I just gotta work out harder. But when you look at the numbers, to burn off 1,000 calories, it takes so much work and so much time, and really, you're just better off being better at the table, like you were talking about.
So there's this great study that was done on the current modern day hunter-gatherers called the Hadza. And it was great because they looked at those and compared them to a sedentary office worker in the United States. So the Hadza are 11 times more active than that office worker. However, the office worker's basal metabolic rate is to burn 2,000 calories a day just existing. Going to the office and doing the work behind the computer, but not exercising and watching football. Well, the Hadza, they also burn 2,000 calories a day.
Right.
With 11 times more activity.
That's amazing.
That's amazing. That means that your body will, because then just think about it, doesn't make sense. If you're 11 times more active, would you need 11 times more food?
It doesn't make sense,
for
right?
a hunter-gatherer, certainly not.
But you also think about the aerobic efficiency,
right?
Of the hunter-gatherer versus the aerobic efficiency of the typical office person.
And that office worker is very out of shape, whereas the hunter-gatherer is lean and already doesn't need to lose any weight.
Right. Yeah, it's not an issue. Yeah. So this was great, Dr. G. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know this was a totally different format, totally different location, and way more time than we usually have for the podcast. But because I got you here up at my camp in the wilderness riding snowmobiles, I figured, you know what? I just want to, have you explain what this is all about, what we're doing, why we do it. And this way, we can try to help people to limit these metabolic issues that they're having so that they can have more freedom and have a better life and go after the dreams that they're shooting for. So I appreciate you being on the show. That's all for this week's of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. Be sure to tune in each and every week so you can stay connected, be inspired, and keep moving towards your goals and living the life that you deserve. Thanks, everybody, and we will see you in next week's podcast. Really good, Dr. G.